Hello everybody, Kyle here from Web Dev Simplified. I know, you have seen a million weather app tutorials before, they're all over the internet, but in this weather app tutorial, I'm going to be doing one thing in particular differently that none of the other tutorials I see do, and this could down the road potentially save you a ton of money. So make sure you don't miss that. Let's get started now. Let's quick take a look at the application we're going to be building. First thing you do, down here, enter some location that you're interested in. You'll see we get a list populated at the bottom, and as soon as we find a location that we want, it'll show us the status, give us an icon, as well as our wind speed, temperature, and precipitation. And this also is based on the location here, so this is in Fahrenheit and miles per hour because we're in the US. But if, for example, we decided to go with England, and we click here, you'll see that the temperature is now in Celsius and the wind speed is in kilometers per hour because it's based on the location that you type in. Now to get started with this weather, we need to have some API to access in order to get both the weather information as well as this location information down here for the different places on Earth. So to get the weather information, we're going to use the DarkSky API. All you need to do is create a simple account on here. It's easy and free to do. And here's all the API documentation we need. And the important thing you need from here is an API key as well as the documentation on where to call. To get your API key, you just click on the console here. It'll show you your API key. I'm going to be resetting this after this video, so don't actually use this API key. Make sure to create your own because this will no longer work afterwards. And the one crucial mistake that most people make is they take this API key and put it directly into their JavaScript on the client side. And the problem with that is if we go back to the documentation and scroll down a little ways, this API, if you sign up for a paid account, will actually charge you for the number of requests that you make after a certain amount of free request. So if you put your API key in the JavaScript itself, then you're going to be opening yourself up to someone stealing that API key and using it for their own means while charging you for it. And this is a mistake so many people make. So in our video, we're going to make sure that we put our API key inside of the server so that no one has access to it except for us. The other thing we're going to need is we're going to need to use the Google's API, which is what's populating this list down here, which is going to be the Google Places API. It's quite a bit more difficult to set up, but I'm going to walk you through all the steps needed when we get to that point. The first thing we need to do though is set up our server using Node.js. So let's open up our Visual Studio Code here. And the very first thing that we need to do is type in npm init, and this will allow us to set up our project. With a package.json, we can just hit enter a bunch of times here to get all the default options, and as you'll see, we'll have an empty package.json here. Next, we want to install all the different dependencies that we're going to need for this project. Luckily, since our project is mostly front-end facing, we don't have very many dependencies. Our main dependencies here that we're going to have, so we'll say npm I, we have Axios, which is going to allow us to call the APIs that we need. It works very similar to Fetch does if you're familiar with that. And also we're going to need Express because that'll just make setting up our server much easier than if we use the default Node HTTP module. And also we want a few development dependencies. So we'll say npm I -- save dev. These will essentially only be for when we're developing. And we want .env to load in our API key, as well as nodemon to automatically refresh our server for us. Now that those are done, let's set up a simple script here in order to run our server. So we'll just call this dev start. And we're just going to set this to nodemon. And we'll call it server.js. This is just going to be the file we create that has all of our server code. So let's create that file now, server.js. Luckily, as I said, this is a really basic Express application. The first thing we want to do is we want to actually load in our environment variables. So we're going to check our environment to make sure we're not in production. And to do that, we can just say that our node environment variable is not equal to production. And if that's the case, we want to require that .env library that we loaded in for development. And all we want to do is call .config. And this is going to load in everything we put inside of our .env file. So let's create that .env file right now. And in here, we're going to put our API key. So let me find that API key. Remember, it's on the console section. We can just copy this API key. And this is the DarkSky API key. So we'll just call it such and set it in there. And now we have access to that API key from inside of our server by just calling this. We'll say const DarkSky API key. And we're just going to set this equal to our process.env, which this is going to populate that variable for us. And again, we just want DarkSky API key, just like that. Let's expand our browser a little bit. And there we go. Now the next thing we want to do is actually set up our server. So we're just going to say const express is equal to require express. And we want to set up our app, which is just going to be the express function being called. And lastly, we need to set up what we want our app to use. This is going to be really basic. We want to use JSON because we're going to be sending JSON to our server. So we'll say express JSON. And we also want to set up our static folder. So we're going to say app.use express static. And this static is just going to be inside of the public folder. This is just standard practice to use the public folder here. And our API is only going to have a single endpoint. So we'll say app.post, and we want this to be our weather endpoint. This is going to get our weather for us from the DarkSky API. And again, like I mentioned, this is where a lot of people mess up. They actually put this inside of their front end, which means their API key is exposed to anyone that has access to the JavaScript, which is anyone that knows how to use the developer tools inside of the browser. It's very unsafe, and we definitely don't want to do that. Inside of here, we're going to implement this later. For now, we're just going to leave it blank, and we're going to actually tell our server what to do. So we're going to say app.listen, tell it the port. In our case, we'll just use 3000. And then this is going to return a function here. And this is going to run when the server starts up. So we'll just say console.log that the server has started. That way we just know when things are working. And if we save that, and we do npm run dev start, which is that command we created in our package.json, we should see everything start up just fine, and that's perfect. And now if we go to our localhost 3000, you'll see that we cannot get /, which is perfect because we haven't actually set up an endpoint for our server here at /, but we know that our server is actually running right now. Before we jump any further, I want to set up a Dot Git Ignore File, and this is for when we're using version control to store our stuff, we don't accidentally check in our environment variables or our node modules. So we want to ignore our environment variable folder and our node modules folder here. Make sure I put that as an underscore. And that'll be that we never accidentally check this into our version control because we don't want to expose this anywhere, as I said, since people can use this to charge us. Now let's create our public folder here. This public folder is going to contain all of the different code for our front end. So the first thing we're going to have is an index.html. This will just be our main page. We're going to have a styles.css for styling our weather app, as well as a script.js, which is just going to run all of the different JavaScript we need in order to call the API. I want to get started by rendering out our index.html page. An easy way to get started with this is type ! and enter in Visual Studio Code, and it'll create the boilerplate code for us. Next, we're just going to title this weather app, and we also want to include in here our style tag. So we'll say link href is going to equal that styles.css, and we need to tell the browser that this is a styles sheet so that it knows how to actually parse this data. And lastly, we want to have a script tag here, which the source is just going to be equal to script.js. Close that off and make sure that we defer this so that it's going to load after our page is done rendering. Now inside of the body here, we can actually do the code for our weather app. So let's take a look at what we have. As you can see, we have a container here, which contains this header section with an icon, as well as the information for our status location and all of the different details of our weather. And then finally, this input down here with our different options for the places. So the very first thing we want to do is we want to wrap everything inside of a container. So we're just going to give a class here of container. Close that off, and everything inside of here, the first thing we're going to have is our header. So again, we'll just use a div for this. Give it a class. Set that equal to header. And the only thing that we need inside of our header is our icon. Our icon is going to be inside of a container again. We'll just call this icon container. That's because we have this nice white circle around it. And our icon, we're actually going to be using Canvas for because we're going to be using a library which will import our icons, and the library takes Canvas icons. So we're going to create a canvas, give it an ID of icon so we can reference it later. And we're also just going to give it a width here of 100 and a height, which is going to equal 100. Close that off, and that's all of our header section done. Next, we want to work on the content section of our page. So after our header, let's create another div. And this div, we're just going to give here a class, which is going to say content. Can't type today, apparently. And inside of this content section, we have our general information as well as our details. So let's create a div for the general information. We'll just call it general information, make it nice and straightforward so that we know what everything is doing. And inside of here, we're just going to have two divs. First div is going to have the class of status, and close that off. And the second div that we're going to want down here is going to be our location. Now, the first thing that we notice, if we refresh this page, we want our default text. So we want enter location to be here. We want to find the weather to be our default text for our location. And this is just what's going to load as soon as we refresh our page. We want the same thing down here for all of our different details of our weather. So now we can go down and do our details section, which is going to be after our general information. Make sure this is a div with a class of details section. Whoops, I really can't type today. There we go. Now inside of this detail section, we're going to have a bunch of different details. And we're just going to give them a generic class of detail so we can share all of our different styles between these different sections. And each one of these details is going to have a div with a class of title, just like this. And our title for the first one is going to be wind. And then we're also going to have a div which is the value. So we'll just give it a class here of value. And this is just going to say to be determined as a default value. Now let's copy this down 2 more times because we're going to have 3 details in total. And we want this one to be temperature, and this next one is going to be precipitation. And there we go. The last thing that we need to do is actually put in our location input. So to do that, let's scroll all the way down to the bottom here. We want to put this inside of all of our containers still. So let's just put it right here. We're going to give it a div that is going to be wrapped around. We're just going to call that our city search container because it's just the container that we're going to put our search bar inside of. And then we need an input, which is going to be our text input. So we'll make sure it has a type of text here. And we want to give it a class of city search. There we go. That way we can actually use this. And we're just going to give it a placeholder as well, which is going to say enter location. Because as you can see here, it has that placeholder text. And we'll close that off. And that's all of the actual code that we need. And you will notice one thing. We have a link down here at the bottom that says powered by DarkSky. And this is required to use the DarkSky API. It actually is mentioned in the documentation. So we need to make sure to put that link. So let's go down at the very bottom of our page, outside of absolutely everything, even this last container div. We're just going to put an anchor tag. The href here is going to go to https :// darksky.net/powered by. And this is just required by the documentation, as I mentioned. Let's also give it a quick class here so we can style this as our DarkSky logo. And close that off, and we want to say powered by DarkSky. Perfect. Now we have all the requirements that we need in order to actually render this properly. Now if we go over to our page here and we refresh this, you'll see that all of our information is being shown up. If I zoom in quite a bit, we can see all of our different sections are showing up. Obviously nothing is styled yet, but that's okay. Now that we have all of that out of the way, all we need to do is set up our Google Maps API. Let's go over to the Google Maps page here. You can get this by just going to console.cloud.google.com, and it'll bring you to this page here. And all you need to do is create your own application. We're just going to create a new project. We're just going to call it whatever we want. I'm just going to call it Weather App Tutorial so that I can easily know what this is. And we click create. There you go. This is going to set up our project. It's going to take a little bit of time, but that is no worry. Now that we have our project created, we can select this project. You should see that it says Weather App Tutorial up here, or whatever you named your project. And from here, we actually want to start setting up our project to use the correct APIs. So all we need to do that is go to this API and services section, which is in the menu, and we click library. From here, we can search all the different APIs we want to use. And there's 2 in particular. We need to use the places API, which you can see right here. Click on it, and we want to make sure that we enable this. As soon as that's done being enabled, we need to go back to the library section and enable one more library. So we'll just go back a few times, and instead of here, we need to use the JS maps. So let's see if we can find it by just typing in JavaScript, or maybe maps. Maps. And there we go, Maps JavaScript API. We also need this enabled so that we can use the Google Maps JavaScript API. As soon as we enable both of those, we need to set up an API key, which we can use inside of our JavaScript. And now this API key is a little bit different than the other API keys that we've been worrying about, because we can actually share this API key in our public JavaScript because it's not anything that we can get charged for. So in order to set up that API key, we just go into this text box here, type in credentials. You'll see credentials pops up, and here we need to create some credentials. We want to create an API key so we can use in our application, and we want to actually restrict this API key. So click restrict key, and as soon as that loads, we just want to scroll down here. We want to strict by API, and we want only the places API and the maps JavaScript API, the 2 that we just enabled. Now we can click save, and this API key will only be able to be used for those 2 particular APIs that we want to use. Now with our API key set up, last thing we need to do is look at the documentation to set this up. To do that, we're just going to go to the places API, click on that, scroll down until we find the documentation, and we want to make sure that we look at the JavaScript documentation. And inside of here is all the documentation we need to set up this places section. And the most important thing here is that we want to be able to load our library properly. So let's just make sure that we click here to choose our API key. This is going to load up real quick. And we already have our Weather App Tutorial selected, as well as the credential that we just created. So we'll insert that, and then we're going to copy this. This is a script tag we need to include inside of our JavaScript. So let's open this index.html up, scroll all the way to the top, make sure it's above our normal script tag. We're going to paste that in, and we need to make sure we add defer to this so that it loads after the entirety of our JavaScript and HTML is loaded and not before. Now if we save that, we are loading in the JavaScript API that we need in order to use that drop-down list. Now with all of that boring stuff out of the way, we can finally jump into the fun part of this tutorial, which is creating the actual JavaScript that is going to call this weather API for us and return the information. To get started, we first want to get our HTML input element. We're just going to call it our search element, and we can just do document.querySelector. And right now we don't have anything good to select by. So let's go into our index.html, scroll down here, and we're just going to put a data attribute on here. We're just going to call this data city search. And that way we can use this data attribute inside of our query selector, inside of brackets, just like this. And this is going to get us our search element. Next thing we want to do is create our search box. This is going to come from that API from Google that we just set up. And to do this, we can just say new google.maps.places.search box. And this is going to be capital search box. And inside of here, we just pass that search element that we just queried. So this essentially says at that search element right here, we want to set up a search box. And then we can set up a listener on that search box. So we can say search box.add listener. And this is not add event listener, this is add listener. This is specific to the Google API. And the listener we want is places changed. This means any time that the check or the box inside of our HTML has a place selected inside of it, this code inside this function is going to be called. And it doesn't actually pass the place that was changed. I wish it did, but it doesn't. We actually have to get that place from the search box. So we can say the place is going to be equal to searchbox.getPlaces. And this actually returns an array of places. And in our case, we only want the first place. So we're just going to get the first place that's being returned. And of course, we want to check first to make sure that this place is not equal to null. So if it is equal to null, all we want to do is just return, because we can't do anything if we don't have a place. Now, after we check to make sure our place exists, we want to get the latitude and longitude. So, and the reason we're doing this is because if we look at the documentation for DarkSky, scroll down just a little ways here, you'll see that we need to have both the latitude and longitude inside of our call for what the API is. It doesn't actually take a city or anything. So in order to get the latitude, we can just say place.geometry.location. And this is going to have both the longitude and latitude, so we can say .lat, it's actually a function, and we can do the same thing, but this one is .lng for longitude. Make sure we type that out, and you can get all the information on all the different methods and properties that this API returns to us by just looking through the Google's API documentation right here for the places section. But since I already know what it is, this is all we really need to worry about for getting the latitude and longitude. Now we can do the fun stuff, which is actually calling our API, which we created, which is /weather, and sending it the latitude and longitude that we need. So in order to use fetch, we need to tell it what method we want to use. In our case, this is going to be a post method because in our server, we set this up as an app.post. Next, we want to send it the different information we're going to need for our headers. This is just so that our application knows that we're sending it JavaScript. To do that, we want to use content type. We want to set this to application/JSON. This just says that we're going to be sending JSON to the server. And for the accept, which is just capital accept, we want to set this as well to application.json/JSON. Make sure I spell that correctly. And this just says that we're going to be getting JSON back from it. And now we can actually send the body of our application. And this body needs to be a JSON object, but we need to stringify it. So we need to say json.stringify. And in here, we'll pass the object we want to send to our server. In our case, we want to send the latitude, and we want to send the longitude. And just like that, that's all the information we need to send, if I spell weather correctly, and this is going to post to our server. And then obviously we're going to have a .then, which is going to take in the data that we get returned, which is going to be a response. We need to convert that response to JSON, so we'll say res.json, and then again, we're going to have a .then, which is going to give the data in an actual object format for us, and inside of here, we're just going to call a function that we're going to create, which is going to call setWeatherData. And inside of here, we're going to pass the data as well as the location. So we'll say place.formatted address. And this formatted address is just going to send it, oops, zoom this out. It's going to send us this string down here so that we can place it up here, which is going to be really nice for us. Now back to our actual application, zoom that in so it's easy to see, and we're going to go to our server, and we're actually just going to in here, console.log request.body. We just want to make sure that we're getting the information sent to our server. So if we check our logs down here, as soon as we enter a location, let's just refresh our page first, make sure all of our JavaScript changes are in here, and type in, we'll see that we get all of our stuff being pre-populated, which means our API integration worked flawlessly. And if we click this, you'll see it sends to our server and logs out latitude and longitude. And that's perfect. Now inside of our server, we can use this DarkSky API key in order to call the DarkSky API. And this is all going to happen on the server, so no one has access to it, which again is the one thing so many people miss out on when doing these types of tutorials. So now let's open up the DarkSky API and see what the URL looks like. Let's just copy this over. This gives us our forecast, which is exactly what we want. We're going to paste this in here inside of a string interpolation. So the first thing we need to do is pass in our key. So let's just replace this variable here with our DarkSky API key, just like that. Next thing we're going to do is our latitude. So again, we're just going to replace that here with request.body.latitude. And we want to do the exact same thing, but this is going to be for our longitude. So replace that, but instead of latitude, we want longitude. And now this is the URL that we're going to use for our server. So we're just going to set this into a variable, call it URL is equal to that. And the very last thing we want to do is we want to add a query parameter, which is called units, and we're going to set that equal to auto. This just means that our units are going to convert based on the location that we query. So if we query somewhere in the US, for example, it's going to be imperial units. And if we query somewhere in England or in Europe, it's going to use metric units. And now we can actually use Axios, which works just very similarly to fetch. So we want to first require Axios up here. Const Axios is going to be equal to required. And we're just going to type in Axios here. There we go. And now we can use Axios. In order to do this, we just call it like it's a function. And we're going to pass it an object. The first parameter of this object is the URL that we want to query, which in our case is just this URL variable that we created. Next thing we need to do is, since we're using Axios, we can just say response type and set it to JSON. And this does all the fancy stuff with headers that we had to do over here with fetch for setting the content type and the accept. And this just says, okay, we're going to be getting JSON, so don't even worry about it. Also, it takes care of the step here where we had to do the .then for res.json. It does all of that automatically for us. So now here inside of our .then, we just have the data of our request back from us. And if we look through this API, you can see it gets sent back a ton of different data. And all we actually want is our current data. So in order to get that, all we need to do is say, data.data, because it's going to be coming inside of an object. And data here is just the actual data from the response. So now once we have data, it's where our object starts here. And we want to get just the basic current information. So we're just going to say .currently. And this is going to be the section inside of our code, which is the most up-to-date current information for our latitude and longitude we sent to DarkSky. And we want to send this as JSON back down to our server. So we'll say res.json, and this is going to send a JSON version of this currently variable back down to our JavaScript here inside of our then. We can comment out this function here, and we can just do a simple console.log of our data. And if we save that, go back to our weather application, refresh this here, and we again type in a location, click on this, and if we inspect our page, you'll see that if we go over to our console, you'll see we get an object being returned, and this object has all of the different information that we need inside of it. As you can see, we have our icon that we'll be using, we have our precipitation, our summary, etc., that we're going to be using to populate all of this information inside of that function, set weather data. So now let's actually create that set weather data function. Scroll down here. We can say function set weather data. It's going to take our data as well as a place. And inside of here, we want to get all of our different elements. And right now we don't have an easy way to do that. So again, we need to add some selectors to these elements. So right here, we're just going to say that this is our data precipitation. Precipitation. I can't spell very well. Right here, we have our temperature. So we'll say data.temperature. And this is just so that we can select these elements in our JavaScript. Again, we're going to do the same thing for wind. Scroll up a ways, we have our location, data location, and we have our status. So data status. And this should be everything that we need to select inside of our JavaScript. Back into our JavaScript, let's create variables for these. So the first thing we want to do is get our location element. We're going to set that equal to document.querySelector for that data. location selector that we just created. Let's copy that down a bunch of times. Next, we're going to have status. So the status element, if I can spell it, really, it is not a good day for me for spelling. It's going to be data status. Next, after that, we're going to have temperature. And this is going to be data temperature. And this is just really fun, repetitive stuff, of course. Precipitation and precipitation. La-di-la-di-la, no fun. And finally, very last one here is going to be wind. And remove that extra one that we don't actually need. And now we can have the fun part of actually setting our data. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say our location element dot text content. This is just going to be the text here, which is going to replace enter location. And this is just going to be the place that we sent down here. Next, we want to do our status. So we'll say status element dot text content, and this is going to be equal to data dot summary. And as you remember, whoops, I cannot spell at all. When we looked at our console logs over here, if I open that up, you see that we had a summary object inside of here, and this is just the summary statement. Next, we're going to do temperature, text content, and this is just data.temperature. And if you want to get all this information, it's of course available on the DarkSky API, as well as in the console log that we printed out. Next, we have precipitation.text content, and this one's going to be a little bit more confusing because we want to convert this to a percentage because it actually returns to us as a decimal. So we'll just say data.precip probability, and we want to just multiply that by 100 so that we get it as a percentage and put a % sign afterwards. There we go. And lastly, we're going to do wind element dot text content, and we're going to set that to the wind speed, which again is inside of here. Now let's close that out, save this, refresh our page, and we're going to enter in a new location. Click on this, and you'll notice that nothing actually happened. So let's inspect our page to see if we got an error. You see that we did get no error, but as you will notice, of course, we didn't uncomment out our function. So, stupid mistake, uncomment that back out, and refresh our page, type in our location again, save this, and you'll see we get everything being populated up here. Well, it looks like wind and precipitation are not being populated for some reason. So let's look at why that is. I'm sure we have a console log error. If we click over to our console, you'll see that we had precip probability is not defined. So, oh, that's of course, I have a slash here instead of a dot. Wow, that's really dumb. Okay, refresh one last time. This should do it. Again, we'll type in Boston. We'll actually do Norway, and there we go. Everything's perfect. We've got temperature, wind, precipitation, everything is pulling through, and our entire API is set up, minus, of course, the icon, which we need to use. And we're going to be using something called SkyCons, which is set up through DarkSky, so they integrate really nicely. We can just go over here to the CDN.js for SkyCon, and we just want to copy this minified version here. It's just going to be slightly smaller. Go into our index, and of course, we just want to put this somewhere before our normal script tag. So we're going to create a script tag for it, make sure it's defer, and we want to set the source here equal to that source. And this is just going to pull in that SkyCons library, and we can check out the SkyCon documentation. So let's just search for that. We'll go in here for SkyCons, and as you can see, it's really straightforward documentation for how to set these up. We're going to create a variable which is called icon, which we're going to set equal to a new SkyCon. And inside of here, we can define the color. In our case, we're going to be using the color here, which is just 222, which is just a really dark gray color for us. Make sure this is actually SkyCons instead of SkyCon. And now we have an icon that we can actually set and use. So let's do that down here. We just say icon.set. This is where the ID that we set on our canvas element went. As you can see here, our canvas has an element of icon as an ID. So we use that exact ID inside of the set here. And then we just want to tell it we want it to be data.icon, because this DarkSky API returns the string of the icon that we need to set. And lastly, since these are animated icons, we can just call icon.play to make it start playing. Now, if we refresh our page, again, we'll search for Boston, click on this, you'll see that we get a nice animated icon up here. It looks really blurry, but that's because I'm zoomed in to 200% on my browser, so you won't actually have this problem. Also, we want to set a default icon for when our page just loads, because as you can see, there is no icon. So we'll just do that right here. We'll say icon.set. Again, we'll get that icon here, and we're going to set this equal to clear day. This is just the default sunny image, and we're going to play this. Now if we refresh our page, you'll see we get the nice little animated sun icon showing up on our page. And right there, that's all the JavaScript code we need. So now we can work on styling our page to make it look just like this over here, which is going to be really fun to do. Open up our styles.css, And the first thing we want to do is the actual body style, because we have this nice yellow to orange colored background. In order to do that, we'll just select our body element here. We want to set the background, and we're going to want to set this to a linear gradient. And we want this just to go to the right, so we're going to put the yellow color on the left and the orange color on the right. And I'm just going to paste these colors in. We're just going to be using this orange color and this red color, and you can use really whatever color you want. It doesn't matter. So now if we save that, go back here, refresh, you'll see that we get that nice orangish red color showing up. The next thing that we want to do is work on making sure all of our content is centered. In order to do that, we're just going to use display flex, which is a really easy way to make us center things. So we can set the justify content to center, as well as the line items to center, but we need to make sure that our page has at least a minimum height of 100. So we're going to set the minimum height here to 100 view height, so that way everything will be centered. And lastly, we just want to set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0, so that we don't have any weird borders around the edges of our page. Save that, refresh our page, and you'll see now everything is already centered and looking pretty great. Now, to make styling everything really easy, we're just going to do a nice little trick that I do on every single page that I work on. Select all of the different elements on our page before and after, and we want to set the box sizing to be equal to border box. And also, I'm going to set the font family so it looks a little bit nicer. I'm going to be using a font called Gotham Rounded. You may not have this font on your default machine, but that's okay. You can choose any font that you want. And I'm going to set this default font to sans serif as a fallback. And refresh, and you'll see already our font is starting to look quite a bit better. Get that back to 100%, and now we can move on to styling our container here. So let's select that. It's just dot container, which we put into our CSS already. And this dot container is going to be fairly straightforward. We want to set a maximum width here of 90%, because as you can see, we don't want it to ever touch the edges of our screen or go past it, so maximum width of 90%. And we want to have an overall width of 1200 pixels if our screen gets too big, because as you can see here, if I expand the size of my screen at a certain point, 1200 pixels, it'll stop getting bigger because we don't want it to become massively huge on big screens. So we have that maximum width here of 1200 pixels. Next, we want to set the background color. So this background color is just simply going to be white, very straightforward, and also a box shadow. Now, box shadow is a fairly difficult property to work with. Essentially, the first few values that you have is your offset for the Y direction and the X direction. So first you have X direction, then we have Y directions, and then we have how much we want the shadow to kind of spread around and blur, and the color of the shadow. So now if we save that, go back over here, refresh, you'll see that we get a shadow at the very bottom because we offset by 0 in the X direction, but by 5 on the Y direction. So put a black border 5 down on our shadow, and it also spread out 10 pixels. So as you can see, it's a little bit around the corners, but mostly on the very bottom. And again, box shadow is a fairly difficult thing to work with, so I'd really recommend looking at the documentation for it if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of using box shadow. Next, after we're done with our container, all we need to do here, lastly, we just want to add a little border radius, give it that nice rounded corner, we'll say 5 pixels for example. We can now move on to styling the content of our page. And the content is essentially everything that's not inside of the header. So to do that, we're just going to add a bunch of padding, so we'll just say 40 pixels, so that we have nice spacing between the edges of our content and the inside of the content. And also, we want to set the margin top to be also a large number of 50 pixels because we don't want this text to come anywhere near our icon. Now that we have the content styled, let's work on the header. Now the header is going to be a bit more involved. First thing that we want to do is actually set the background color for our header. This background color, we want to be the exact same as our icon color. So again, if you remember, that's just going to be 222. Set that in there like that. And we also want to set a height of 120 pixels. And the reason we're hard coding this height is so that we can easily position our icon inside of it. We're going to set the display to flex, and we want to justify the content inside of it in the center because we want this icon to be centered. Also, we want to align our items to be flex end because we want the icon to show up at the bottom and not the top of the container. And finally, we need to add a border radius to this as well. So we'll say border radius, and we only want this to be in the top left corner of our screen of the 5 pixels, and we want to do the same thing but for top right. And if we go back, refresh this, you'll see we have the nice rounded corners. And if we get rid of these 2 borders, you'll see that our corners over here when we refresh are square. So we need to make sure that we have the border radius here as well as on our actual container itself so that everything works perfectly. Now let's go back here to make sure we have everything we need, and we can start working on the icon. Now the icon is going to be a bit difficult as well to style because we're going to need to position this using position relative. So let's set that position to relative. And all we want to do is put the top here to 50 pixels, and we want to set the padding to be 20 pixels. And the reason we're doing the padding is so we can get some space around our icon where the white will show through. So in order to make sure it's white that shows through, we want to set a background color, and this background color will be white. Also, we're going to set an actual hard-coded width of 140 pixels and a hard-coded height here of exactly the same thing, 140 pixels. And lastly, in order to make this a circle, we'll set the border radius to be 50%, just like that. Save that. Go over here and refresh, and you'll see our icon does seem to be a little bit too high though, so let's increase this top here to 70 pixels and refresh that, and now it's actually dead centered inside of our line, which is what we want. Now onto the meat and potatoes, we have our actual information for our weather. The first thing we want to style is the general information. So we're going to select that class, which is just general information. And this is going to be, again, just using display flex. I really like display flex for setting up columns and items. We're going to set the flex direction to column so that they're stacked vertically on top of each other like this. And we want to just align the items in the center. That is the real power of using Flexbox. It really makes it easy to line things up in the center. Also, we're just going to give a little padding around this so that nothing's too close to each other. Now we can style the actual status. We're going to give it a font size. Whoops, make sure that I actually put this inside of here. Font size, we're going to use 3 rem, and we're also going to do a font weight of bold. Now let's go back to our weather app, refresh that, and that's looking perfect. We can do essentially the exact same thing, but this is going to be for our location instead. And our location is going to have a font size of 2 rem, a font weight of normal, and we also want a little bit of a margin on the top. So we'll say margin top of 10 pixels. Save that, refresh, and there we go. Our status section is exactly as we want it, and all we have left is these details sections and our button at the bottom. So let's select our details section. Again, type out that class name, and we'll put everything inside of here. And as you guessed it, we're going to be using display flex with justify content space between this time, so that way we can get our elements spaced out as far apart from each other as possible. And we're going to put the margin on the top to be 40 pixels. Again, just spacing everything out for us. Next, we can move on to the actual detail. Make sure I spell this properly. I am terrible at spelling today. So onto the detail, and inside of here, again, you guessed it, display flex. This one's going to have a flex direction of column because, as you can see here, everything's vertically on top of each other, and we want to align our items in the center. We also want to set a flex basis of 0. This just means that everything is going to grow from 0 so that nothing is going to be different sized or too large or too small. Everything is going to take up an even amount of space. And lastly, we need to put flex grow. We want to set this to a 1 so that our elements will grow if they can, and a padding of 20 pixels, again, spacing around everything. Now if we save that, go look over here. Already you can see our items are spaced out from each other, but of course they're too small to read. So let's increase that size quite a bit. We can go into our detail here. We can select the title. And all we want to do for this is we set the font size to be 2 rem. We're going to make it flex grow as well, so it takes up as much space as possible. And we want this to be bold because this is our title. So we'll set it to bold. And the color is just going to be kind of a lightish gray color, 777. That way it blends a little bit in the background. Save that, and there we go. Our titles are set up perfectly. And all we have left is the value. Just go down here, detail.value. And we want to put the font size of 2 rem and a margin on the top, again, to space everything out of 20 pixels. Now if we refresh that, there we go. This is looking great. But of course you'll notice we don't actually have these borders between our elements. So in order to do that, we'll go into our index.html. We want our middle one to be bordered. So we're just going to give it a class here of bordered. And inside of our styles, we can select that by saying .detail.bordered. So the center one, in this case, we want to set a border on the left, which is going to be 1 pixel solid. And we want to use that exact same 777 color. And we're going to do the exact same thing on the right as well. Now if we save that and refresh, we get our borders right down the middle. And all we have left is our actual styling of our city selection box right here. First, we want to select the container it's inside of. So we'll just say city search container. And yep, you guessed it, display flex again. And this time we're just using it so that we can center our content. And if we save that, refresh, you'll see that it puts it right in the center of our page for us. Next thing we want to do is actually style the select itself. So we'll say city search. And instead of here, we're going to put a large margin on the top, again, just to space things out. We're going to put the font size to 2 rem, again, make it more readable for you guys. Remove the outline, so outline none. Border on this thing is going to be 1 pixel of that same exact solid 777 color. And we're going to give it a nice little bit of rounding of 5 pixels, some padding inside of our input element so that it's spaced out from the edges, not right up on the edges. And we want the width to be equal to 100% so that we have plenty of space to type in. Now if we refresh that, you'll see that our input looks great, but you'll notice as we start typing, our text down here is still incredibly small. So we need to use the Google API to style that, and they have all the classes set up where you need to use them on their API, but I'm just going to list them out for you guys because I already know exactly what they are. The first thing we need to do is the PAC item. Instead of here, we just want to change the font size to be 2 rem, and we want to set some padding around it. This PAC item is essentially each row inside of this drop down here. So we're just giving them a bit of padding and a larger font size. Also, this icon, if we type in here, you see this icon that shows up on the left. I might zoom in so it's easier to see. We don't actually want that icon, so we're just going to remove that by selecting the PAC icon, and we're going to set the display here to none. Lastly, all we want to do is, again, select PAC item query, and this, if we type in down here, is just going to be this blackish section right here, because if we save and refresh, you'll notice as we're typing, this black section is smaller than all of the rest of the sections, so we just need to bump up the font size on this. So we'll increase the font size to 2 rem, just so it's the same as everything else, and we're going to set some padding on the right, just like this, and we just want that to be 14 pixels. We just want to space everything out. Now if we refresh and start typing in here, you'll see that down here our options for selection are equally as large as the rest of the text in our application. And for you, you may not have to increase this text size, but in order to make this easier to see in the video for you, I've increased the text size. Now the last thing we have is this Powered by DarkSky button right here. On our actual application, we just have it off into the corner in the bottom of our screen so it doesn't take up much space. So let's do that exact same thing over here. The easiest way to position something so that it's out of the way in the corner of the screen is going to be using position absolute. And now if you aren't familiar with position absolute, I have an entire video I just released on that, so make sure you check that out in the cards and the description linked. Also, what we're going to do here is set the bottom to 20 pixels, and we're going to set the right to 20 pixels. This is just going to put it in the bottom right. We're going to set the color to this nice grayish color so that it really doesn't clash too much with our application. And I'm just going to increase the font size again so that it's easier for you guys to see. Now if we save that and refresh, you see that it's being put down here right into the bottom corner. Now let's make sure our application still works. We'll just search for Boston, and we'll see everything populates and it looks really nice. I'll even make this bigger so it's easier to see. And now let's search for something like, we'll just say something in Sweden. And again, you can see everything populates and looks really nice. Now, if you enjoyed that weather app related tutorial, make sure to check out my other project-based tutorials, which will be linked over here. Also, subscribe to the channel so that you can get more project-based tutorials just like this, and let me know down in the comments what projects you want me to create after this, because I really love making these project-based videos. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a good day.